that we find here in these first 5 verses. If you'll follow along, the words will be on the monitor as well. Then Naomi, her mother-in-law, said to her, "My daughter, should I not seek rest for you, that it may be well with you? Is not Boaz our relative with whose young women you were? See, he is winnowing barley tonight at the threshing floor. Wash, therefore, and anoint yourself, and put on your cloak, and go down to the threshing floor. But do not make yourself known to the man until he's finished eating and drinking. But when he lies down, observe the place where he lies, then go up and uncover his feet, and lie down, and he will tell you what to do." And Ruth replied, "All that you say, I will do." And so you see here, even in the words, Naomi's words, you see the difficult it was for women in this day to survive without a husband. In Ruth's day, it was especially difficult for them to survive without a husband, and this went for Ruth and Naomi both. Because Naomi's sons had both died before having sons of their own. If you remember, Ruth had a sister-in-law, both of their husbands died. So because Naomi's sons had both died before giving sons of their own, and because of Elimelech's land, right, Naomi's husband Elimelech's land had no heir inside their immediate family since both sons had died. Jewish law made provision for this in what was called a kinsman redeemer. A kinsman redeemer. The Hebrew word goel. Goel. I titled the sermon, which is not the flashiest title ever, Goel is for gospel. Goel, kinsman redeemer. The kinsman redeemer had to be a close relative, close to the deceased. And if they wished, they could marry, they didn't have to, but they could marry the deceased the deceased relative's widow with the intent to raise up a son in the deceased's name. We don't have this mechanism today. It seems kind of weird if we're really honest about it. So this kinsman redeemer would have a son with the deceased man's widow. So this son would not bear this man's name, the redeemer's name, but would bear the name of the deceased husband. So this son that would be born from this kinsman redeemer in this relationship would be the rightful heir of the family land and would continue the bloodline of that family name. Naomi was an older woman, likely past childbearing age and unlikely to be remarried at this time. Her hope was that Ruth would find a husband. And not just any husband, but one that was qualified. One that was qualified to redeem her family's land by raising up a son in her son's name. And so Ruth had been gleaning. She had been going around the outskirts of a field. And Jewish law had kind of what we would call like a modern day SNAP program, supplemental nutrition assistance program, food stamps in the Jewish law providing sustenance for the poor. So written into God's law was to care for the poor. Ruth and Naomi are poor, and so they're outside. She's outside gleaning. She's taking barley. She's taking barley from the outskirts of this field. And chapter 2 says it just so happens to be Boaz's field. Right, and so God leads her directly to this field, and so she's outside gleaning from the outskirts of the field. And Naomi has already told us in chapter 2, in verse 20, that Boaz was one of the kinsman redeemers, the Goel. Naomi, whose name meant pleasant, if you remember at the end of chapter 1, or in the first part of chapter 2, has asked all of the people to call her Mara, bitter. Because she had gone out full and had returned empty, she says. But now, Naomi seems to be seeing through her grief right? The death of her husband, the death of her two sons. She's now starting to see a little glimmer of light, a little bit of hope. That all of a sudden Ruth is gleaning in this field, this guy named Boaz, and she's like, I know Boaz. And it seems like Naomi is starting to recognize that God was doing something. So Naomi devises a plan to have Ruth pop the question to Boaz. She tells Ruth to wash up. She tells Ruth to put on some perfume. She tells Ruth to go put on her best cloak, dress, whatever, right? Put on some nice clothes and go down to the threshing floor at night. The threshing floor was the place where they took the barley stalks that they had cut out of the field, and it was just hard packed dirt. And they would take handfuls of the barley reeds and they would beat them against the threshing floor. And when they beat the heads of the barley on the threshing floor, the grain would begin to drop out of it. And they would beat it, and it was a windy night, and they would throw it up in the air, and the air would take the barley stalks, like the straw, would blow it away, and any other grain that was still in those heads, because of the weight, would fall to the threshing floor. And so that's what's going on. They're harvesting barley. And so Naomi tells her to go down to this threshing floor. And she says to uncover his feet and lie down, and he will tell you what to do. This was absolutely a sexual proposition. But this was not just a sexual proposition. This was a marriage proposal. Sex was to be the consummation of the marriage. Naomi was not telling Ruth to go down and hook up with Boaz. She was telling her to go down and marry Boaz if he was willing. This was potentially very dangerous for Ruth. Ruth, a foreign young woman, going at night to a field where a bunch of men were just finishing off their nightcap. She could be assaulted by the young field workers. What if Boaz isn't interested in marrying her? What if he humiliates her? What if he takes advantage of her? Ruth had everything to lose. But she responds to Naomi's plan. All that you say, I will do. And so Ruth, this foreign, widowed woman, chooses to do the unlikely. Chooses to do the hard thing. Recognizes Naomi's need, recognizes the need of her family, lineage, land, and does the hard thing. So this brings us to scene 2, which takes place at the threshing floor. If you'll read with me verses 6 through 15. So she went down to the threshing floor and did just as her mother-in-law had commanded her. And when Boaz had eaten and drunk, and his heart was merry, he went to lie down at the end of the heap of grain. Then she came softly and uncovered his feet and lay down. And at midnight the man was startled and turned over, and behold, a woman lay at his feet. And he said, "Who are you?" And she answered, "I am Ruth, your servant. Spread your wings over your servant, for you are a redeemer." And he said, May you be blessed by the Lord, my daughter. You have made this last kindness, this last hesed, greater than the first, and that you have not gone after young men, whether poor or rich. And now, my daughter, do not fear. I will do for you all that you ask, for all my fellow townsmen know that you are a worthy woman. And now it's true that I am a redeemer, yet there is a redeemer nearer than I. Remain tonight, and in the morning, if he will redeem you, good, let him do it. But if he's not willing to redeem you, then as the Lord lives, I will redeem you. So lie down until the morning. So she lay at his feet until the morning, but arose before one could recognize another. And he said, let it not be known that a woman came to the threshing floor. And he said, bring the garment you are wearing and hold it out. So she held it out, and he measured out 6 measures of barley and put it on her. And then she went to the city. Ruth goes down to the threshing floor. She remains unseen until Boaz's heart was merry. You thought I was reading into the nightcap thing, right? And his heart is merry. He lays at the end of the grain heap. And as he's sleeping, she makes her move. She uncovers his feet, lies down at his feet. He awakens around midnight, and he's startled. He notices a woman laying at his feet, and he demands to know who she is. And so Ruth responds, I am your servant. Now that just seems odd. Right? I'm your servant. Where does this come from? I think this is a reference back to their first conversation. In chapter 2, listen to verse 13. If I can find it with my eyes. Then she said, I have found favor in your eyes, my Lord, in talking to Boaz, for you have comforted me and spoken kindly to your servant, though I am not one of your servants. It's an expression of humility of her humble circumstances. And so she's getting ready to ask him to marry her, to be a kinsman redeemer for her deceased husband. This is a big ask. He was in no way obligated to do this. She responds in a very humble manner, right? She's a poor foreign widow. She desperately needs a husband to provide for her, to care for her, and she could have sought that in any man, right, as expressed in Boaz's words. But she's thinking beyond her own personal needs and is acting actually quite selflessly. And she seeks to care for Naomi's needs and see that Elimelech's land be redeemed by raising up a son in her deceased husband Mahlon's name. Asking this successful businessman, Boaz, an older man, to marry her, to marry a poor widowed foreign girl. That this was big. This was a big ask. But here it goes. So she says, spread your wings over me, over your servant, for you are a redeemer, a goel. Spread your wings is interesting. If you remember in chapter 2, the verse just before what we read, the first interaction that Ruth and Boaz had when she was gleaning in his field, Boaz tells his female workers to take extra care of her. Right? And so they pull her inside the field, not just on the outskirts, and encourages the men to drop some grain behind them for her to easily pick up. So when they meet face to face for the first time, she asks him, why did you treat me with such kindness? That Hebrew word hesed. Why did you treat me with such loving kindness? Me, a poor foreign widow. So Boaz tells her in verse 12 that he's impressed with her character, with the way that she had left her homeland to come and care for Naomi. Look at Boaz's words in 2 verse 12. The Lord repay you for what you've done, and full reward be given to you by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge. Under whose wings you have come to take refuge. In their first interaction, Boaz has petitioned the Lord. This is Boaz's prayer request. Lord, take care of this girl under your wings. This was a common picture of God in Psalms, depicting God spreading his wings over his people in an act of care and protection like a bird would do with their young. Ruth, having uncovered Boaz's feet, now asks him to cover her with his garment, with his wings. This was the marriage proposal: cover me with your garment. This was a very specific ask: cover me with your wings, cover me with your garment, because you are a goel, you are a kinsman redeemer. This custom of a husband covering his bride with his garment is likely where the wedding veil has its roots. The veil in ancient culture was worn by married women to send a clear message that they were indeed married. It was a sign of commitment. Even in non-religious communities such as the Roman Empire, unmarried women were not permitted to wear veils, only married women. There was a strict punishment for women who wore veils but were unmarried. And if a married woman didn't wear her veil, it was grounds for divorce, as it was seen as her propositioning herself. So in Western culture, the wedding veil, only to be drawn back from the groom, from the husband, is a sign of commitment. Only the husband has the privilege to draw back the veil from the bride's face. Only he is to know her that intimately. That's on here. Ruth is asking Boaz to be the answer to his own prayer. His own prayer request for God to spread his wings over Ruth. Spread your wings over me, Boaz. Be the practical wings of God, if you would, over me and my family. How does Boaz respond? In verse 10, he says, may you be blessed by the Lord, my daughter. You have made this last kindness. You have made this last chesed greater than the first, in that you have not gone after young men, whether poor or rich. So how does he respond? He sees her proposition as one of loving kindness, one of chesed. Loving kindness to Naomi and the deceased, which had so impressed him, and now loving kindness to Boaz himself, that she would consider him to be her husband, to be her redeemer. His words continue in verse 11, and now, my daughter, do not fear. I will do for you all that you ask, for my fellow townsmen know that you are a worthy woman. Word had gotten out about Ruth's character. In Hebrew, this term, worthy woman, is the Hebrew Eset Chayel, a woman of great character. She was highly respected already in this community. In chapter 2, in verse 1, if you remember, the narrator tells us that Boaz was a worthy man. Hebrew, a Gibor Hayel. In the story, it seems that these two were meant for one another. It's so obviously a match made in heaven. Ruth did not just so happen to stumble upon this field owned by a Goel named Boaz. They are Eset Hayel and Gibber Hayel. It seems as though everything is coming together for a storybook ending, but then we see verse 12 in chapter 3. And now it is true that I am a redeemer, a Goel. Yet there is a redeemer nearer than I. Remain tonight, and in the morning, if he will redeem you, good. Let him do it. But if he's not willing to redeem you, then as the Lord lives, I will redeem you. Lie down until the morning. So these are outstanding godly people. Nothing sexually has happened. But Boaz had done his homework before that night. I find that so interesting. He was already interested. He was interested in Ruth, but there was a problem. There was a man that was a nearer relative than him, who was qualified to function as the Goel, as the kinsman redeemer. And he needed to be given the opportunity to redeem Ruth. And so you have this tension. It's like, no, no. He sends her off in the morning with grain to take back to Naomi. Remember the one that was now bitter and sent out full, brought back empty. He sends her off with a bunch of grain in her garment to go back to empty Naomi. This brings us to the final scene of Ruth 3, which takes place again back at Naomi's house. Let's read these final verses of chapter 3, verses 16 through 18. And when she came to her mother-in-law, she said, "How did you fare, my daughter?" Then she told her all that the man had done for her, saying, "These 6 measures of barley he gave to me, for he said to me, you must not go back," what? Empty-handed. Beautiful, right? You must not go back empty-handed to your mother-in-law. And she replied, "Wait, my daughter, until you learn how the matter turns out, for the man will not rest, but will settle the matter today." And that's where chapter 3 leaves us, in this tension, wondering what in the world's going to happen. It leaves us in suspense for a whole week, left wondering, what is this other possible Goel, kinsman redeemer, like? What if he's a terrible man, unlike Boaz? Because I feel like we all have this idea that Boaz is this dapper, older, stately man, and this other guy's got to be just hideous, right? We're left with the feeling that any other man would just be a downgrade for Ruth at this point. Boaz has been painted as this knight in shining armor, a godly man that has only treated Ruth with kindness, chesed, and honor. This Gibor Hayel, this man of honor. These themes of chesed, this loving kindness, these wings of protection, and this Goel, kinsman redeemer, are meant to point us to a greater reality. This love story points us to an even greater love story. The story of Ruth is in the Bible because God is communicating something about himself to us through the story of Ruth. When we see the chesed, the loving kindness of Ruth towards Naomi and towards Elimelech's line and towards Boaz. We're to see it as a picture of God's love for us. The provision in Jewish law for a kinsman redeemer is to point us to an even greater redeemer that we have in Jesus. This is what we mean by seeing Jesus through the lens of the Old Testament. God's writing a story from the first pages to the last. He's telling us all about himself, about who he is, about how he loves, about his redemptive plan, not just to redeem a lineage of human beings, but to redeem a whole people for himself. A people that he calls his children. The whole Bible is a love story. The story of the true and better Gibber Hayel, who has spread his wings of loving protection over us. His redeemed family. God's redeemed bride that he died for. We're impressed by a young woman who's left her homeland to redeem the land and bloodline of Naomi's deceased husband, because Ruth points us to Jesus. Like, we love the story because it points us to Jesus. The one who left his heavenly home to come and to redeem those that are lost. The whole Bible is a narrative of how people come to know Christ, how people are forgiven and gathered into God's family. The Bible starts off, right, with the story of the first humans, Adam and Eve, that sinned and caused all of humanity to be in a fallen, sinful state of being, deserving of judgment. Adam and Eve cast out of the garden, and the tension was created to cause us to ask the question, how will they ever get back into the garden? How will they get back to the place where everything was perfect? Everything was provided for. How will humanity get back to that place where they walk through the garden talking with God as just with friends because they were sinless? This tension, like the book of Ruth, where we're saying, what about this other guy? The tension of the Bible is, how will you get back to that relationship with God? The relationship that Adam and Eve once enjoyed, but was affected because of their sin. The whole Bible's written to right that. Our sin, Adam and Eve's sin, couldn't just simply be forgotten about. It had to be paid for. Jesus paid for your sin and my sin when he died on the cross. Just as Ruth was not obligated to seek out a Goel, a kinsman redeemer, she could have just went out and found the youngest, cutest guy, whether poor or rich, as Boaz says. She wasn't obligated to seek out a kinsman redeemer, just as Boaz was not obligated to marry Ruth. God was not obligated to send Jesus, but chose to send Jesus. sink in. That's God's story. We identify with Ruth in that we're in a vulnerable situation. Feeling the weight of our sin, right? The weight of the things that we've done that we shouldn't have done. The weight of failing to do the things that we should have done. And like Adam and Eve outside of the garden, we're going, I've blown it. How can I get to God? Because of God's loving kindness, his chesed, New Testament Greek, his agape love. He chose to send Jesus, our true and better Goel, Redeemer, and King, that we might be made right in God's sight because of his work on the cross. That's the gospel. That's the whole story of the Bible. No idea where I'm at on my notes. It's okay. Ruth 3 is a story of a foreign widow who risked her everything to bring redemption to her broken family. It begs the question, in what ways are we willing to take risk to be this living, tangible expression of gospel redemption? In what ways are we willing to risk to be an expression, tangible expression in other people's lives of the love of God represented in Jesus? We live in one of the most affluent, well-to-do counties in the country, probably the world. But there's brokenness all around us. But you can easily miss it if you're not paying attention. Hutch Kale and I recently met with some folks from our school board and from the sheriff's department and one of the local schools to try to be educated about the tangible needs going on, specifically at Brook Point, and since then leaned a little bit into Stafford Middle School. And the reality is that there's folks in our community that go without food. There's kids that don't have food on the weekends. And there's kids that, outside of the free lunches and breakfast at the public school, what about summer? What about spring break? There's families that can barely afford to make rent, let alone furnish their houses and buy mattresses. There's this invisible brokenness all around us. But from our positions, from our places of privilege, we often don't notice it. And the reality is, even outside of those basic needs, the people next door to you and the people sitting beside you this morning have needs that are not being met. They might be emotional. They might be physical. They could be in an abusive relationship. They might just be struggling to cope with their past. And God's people have to be like a Ruth that risks even your reputation to step out of your comfort zone and step towards someone else that so desperately needs to see this hesed, this loving kindness of our great God So we're in the beginning stages of trying to figure out how we as Pillar Stafford can maybe lean into some of these needs in our community, and we're taking it slow, because we really want to do a good job of really evaluating those things. But there's needs all over. If we're not careful, we can be so comfortable that we just become so out of touch with the actual needs that people have. We can be so distracted in our lives of social media and whatever our current hobby or passion could be. Right? Whatever we love to read and whatever we love to study, whatever we love to do outside or whatever, we could just become so consumed with other things that are of less importance. Not saying fishing is of less importance, but I am saying that there are some obviously more significant needs in the community. The story of Ruth is beautiful because it's the story of the whole Bible. It's the story of God's love and redemption extended to a broken people in need of a Savior, people like me and people like you and people like our neighbors and our coworkers and those in the schools and those all over our community. Don't you want your life to be shaped by this story? Like if God saw fit to give us these 66 books, all for the single purpose of communicating his redemptive plan for humanity, is that not enough to dedicate my life to? Last statement, and we're done. Ruth reminds us that no matter how far you have been away from God in the past, that you are redeemable. God is writing his love story on your life. Are you aware of your vulnerable position? Are you aware of your need of redemption? Maybe today, will you, even for the first time, put your faith in our true and better Goel, true and better Redeemer? Let's stand and pray. Lord, your word is so rich and beautiful. We have not exhausted it. We can't exhaust it. But Jesus, I pray for those this morning, Lord, that may be far away from God, be far away from you, Lord. Lord, that by your Spirit, that you're communicating that you can and will redeem them if they put their faith and their trust in you as their Savior. And Jesus, help us that already know you, Lord, to allow the central truth of your scripture to dominate our life message. Lord, that we would be about redemption, Lord, communicating value to those that are in our community.